Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
62 Eurosceptic Conservative MPs have been accused of trying to hold Theresa May hostage after sending her a list of what they call suggestions for the Brexit deal they want to see. This comes ahead of tomorrow's cabinet meeting at Chequers, which is due to decide the government's position on the UK's future relationship with the EU. With me is our political correspondent, Lewis Goodall. So, Lewis, what's the import of this letter? What are they asking for?
Well, clearly the import is just as you say, Adam, because it comes at a crucial time, just ahead of Thursday's make or break, as these things are often billed, Chequers meeting with the Cabinet. It reads like a full list of the sort of Brexit nirvana that the so-called hard Brexiteers would most like. They want to ensure that we can have regulatory divergence from the EU once we leave the European Union. They want to make sure that we can negotiate our own trade deals during the transition period, and they say that they don't want any transition period to actually take place at all unless we've already negotiated the end deal in full. Now, a lot of people think that that is especially unlikely, i.e. they don't want negotiations on the end deal to take place in the transition period. They want it all to be complete as soon as possible. It seems quite unlikely.
And how has the government reacted to this letter? I mean, it would appear to be an attempt to box in Mrs May's negotiating
Well,
position.
Downing Street spokesman has said that they welcome all contributions, but of course I think they will welcome this like a hole in the head. Look, it reads incredibly friendly. They're saying, look, we are just trying to support you, Prime Minister. For me, the most interesting and compelling bit actually comes at the very first paragraph, where they say, we're writing to underline our support both for your Brexit leadership and for the vision of your speech at Lancaster House a year ago. Very telling, they don't mention the Florence speech, which of course was considered to be much more conciliatory towards the European Union, but instead focusing on the Lancaster House speech. And you could say that Theresa May, in a way, made a rod for her own back when she made that speech, and she set out what many people did consider a quite hard Brexit. She defined Brexit in a quite hard Brexit fashion, thereby effectively saying that the only legitimate sort of Brexit really you could have was that sort of hard Brexit. As she has had to try and make some compromises with that vision, so she's getting this pushback from 60 or so of her own MPs, but clearly it just adds to an already very constrained position that she has.
Yeah, well, it's headed private and confidential, but obviously not. Lewis, thank you very much indeed. Peter Bone, one of the signatories, is here. We say suggestions, it sounds more like demands in this letter. Your government must have the ability to change. Your government must make sure that the guidelines are followed. I mean, you're dictating to the Prime Minister.
Well, good morning. 401 days until we come out of this dreadful European Union superstate, and that letter you have there quite clearly says we're 100% behind the Prime Minister, and it's helpful to set out some ideas, for instance, that we should have regulatory autonomy when we come out of the EU, and that we should be able to do our own free trade deals, which of course pretty much is what the Prime Minister is saying anyway. Well,
hang on, I mean, you are dictating, you're not offering suggestions, you're saying you must do this. There's clearly, I mean, there's what the Times says, which revealed this letter, passive-aggressive threat, really.
I don't think... that letter, I don't see how that could ever be interpreted that way, because it's wholesome support for what the Prime Minister is doing. What it is saying is there's a lot of technical stuff in there.
It's support for her when she's doing what you want, but implicitly...
Well, no, she's doing what the country wants, the right thing. But there are some technical things there.
Are you now reconciled to a hard border with Ireland?
No, there's not going to be a hard border with Northern Ireland, and there's nothing in there that suggests there's going to be a hard border with Northern Ireland.
Well, you're saying no customs union with the EU. And according to the Times, that says that's not a workable plan. It means that there would be a hard border between Northern Ireland and
that is government policy, and that is not... The Times is not right on that.
But are you saying that being out of the customs union is more important than whether or not there is a hard border with Northern Ireland?
But it isn't one or the other. You won't be in the customs...
Many experts say it is one or the other, including the European Union.
Well, I really don't think we should be necessarily taking the European Union's view on what's best for the British, for the United Kingdom.
Except it takes two to negotiate, doesn't it?
And of course, this is, and as you rightly know, this, of course, is all part of the negotiation. Yeah. But there will not be I absolutely guarantee a hard border in
So
Northern
there may
Ireland.
be a customs union.
No, there won't be what we're going to have a frictionless border, which is could you imagine any British government, putting up a border in Northern Ireland between the divide? It's just not going to happen, is it?
No, but it's a reality that if you have different trade blocks that don't have a customs union, there has to be some kind of... But,
no, that's not going to happen.
But I do want to ask you on the principle, because some of your colleagues, Owen Paterson, one of them, is now saying, look, actually the Belfast Agreement is past its sell-by date. You know, it was 20 years ago, and we need to move on from that. Do you think that's right?
Well, I haven't heard him say that. And I don't
well, he has said it.
Well, I don't think that's how you could possibly interpret it. And that's got nothing to do with that letter whatsoever.
Well, if it comes down to it, if the choice is do what you want in terms of no customs union and break the Belfast Agreement, what's your answer to that? Which is more important?
We don't have to, but these are look, I don't want to be awkward on this, but neither of those things are going to happen.
You're talking about a position there.
No, can you show me in that letter where it talks about Northern Ireland?
Well, exactly, it doesn't.
It doesn't
talk about the consequences of international trade.
It's a frictionless border. We're going to have a special relationship with the European Union. So we don't have to impose any tariffs whatsoever.
Well, all right, we go to World Trade Organization principles. You're saying during the transition, so not even at the end of the 2-year implementation.
No, what it's saying there is basics of doing free trade deals.
Yeah.
What we are saying, from as soon as we come out, if we are no longer in the European Union, we should have our right to do our own free trade deals. And that is absolutely obvious.
And that means going to World Trade Organization deals, and that means automatic 10% tariffs, doesn't it?
Why do you say that?
Well, because I talk to people who are trading internationally, and they say the consequences of going to WTO, coming out of the European Union without a deal, is automatically 10% tariffs.
And that is incorrect, because we can establish whatever tariffs we want. So, for instance, if you've got a 10.5% import duty on a Japanese car at the moment, we could take that off. We don't have to impose any duties on...
No, but it goes both ways, doesn't it? And as continuing members of the WTO, the EU would have no alternative but to do that, which would increase costs of trade.
There is very strong legal advice, because our regulatory alignment at the moment, the day we come out of the EU, there would be no requirement to impose any tax. In fact, there's a legal opinion to say that would be discrimination and it's actually illegal to do that. I mean, it would be illegal for the European Union to do that.
If the Prime Minister doesn't comply with all of what you listed in your letter, will you vote against them when it comes to the crunch in the Parliament?
What we're going to do is achieve a special relationship with the European Union. These are helpful ideas to the Prime Minister along the way. Everybody is lobbying the Prime Minister.
Will you vote against that?
I'm not going to vote against something that I don't even know what's on the table. Because lots of things might happen. But what is actually more likely to happen is we are going to get a deep and special relationship with the European Union. That's what the Prime Minister is going to deliver on, and she has my full support on that.
Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Now, more than 60 Eurosceptic Tory MPs have written a letter laying down their red lines for the next stage of Brexit negotiations. The letter, which was sent last week, comes as the Prime Minister tries to get her cabinet to agree on common positions. Our Emma has the details. Emma.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, it's time to crack open the Blue Nun, because there's a house party at Chequers. Tomorrow evening, Theresa May will host her Brexit subcommittee of senior ministers to try to thrash out what they want their final deal to look like. Now, there's been a series of speeches by Mrs May and her senior team outlining their vision. The Prime Minister herself has said she wants a deep and special partnership with the EU and has promised Britain would remain committed to Europe's security. The Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, has said Brexit was a cause for hope, not fear, and argued we had to leave the single market and the customs union to enjoy the benefits of Brexit. Yesterday, the Brexit Secretary David Davis promised Britain will lead a global race to the top in rights and standards. And the Environment Secretary, Michael Gove, has claimed we'll have a green Brexit, arguing there's a historic opportunity to improve the environment. Today, David Davis will outline Britain's official response to the EU's Brexit transition proposals. He's expected to say Britain needs protection from future EU laws that could cause us harm during the transition. However, the party is having some gate crashes. The European Research Group, which is comprised of over 60 Conservative MPs, led by Jacob Rees-Mogg, has written to the Prime Minister with a list of helpful suggestions for Brexit that include arguing that Britain should be free to negotiate and sign trade deals as soon as we leave next year. And they say there should be full regulatory autonomy during the transition period, a view that is at odds with others in the party. Nicky Morgan, who voted to stay in the EU, called the letter a ransom note and said the ERG was taking Theresa May hostage. Andrew.
Thanks for that. So the European Research Group, you used to chair that, I think, Steve Baker.
I did chair it, yes.
OK. Its report, or its letter to the Prime Minister, says it wants, quote, full regulatory autonomy for Britain during the transition period. Do you agree with that?
Well, the government's policy is that during the implementation period, we'll continue our relationship with the European Union on the same fundamental basis as we do today, but as a third country outside the formal structure.
So not full regulatory autonomy.
So where we need to land after the implementation period is...
No, I'm talking about the transition. You call it implementation, I call it transition. Let's call the whole thing off.
The government's policy...
no, you don't agree with the ERG on this?
Well, my job is to agree with the government. I'm a member of the government and I will support the government's policy. But the policy is to have an implementation period which allows us to become a third country and conclude our future relationship agreement. And it's within that future relationship agreement that we should have full regulatory autonomy, which is a policy which the Prime Minister has set out throughout the course of the speech.
Is it broadly the government's position that we should remain aligned to EU rules and regulations even after the transition?
So the position that David Davis set out is the government's position. So we need to maintain high standards, but we should have control of our own laws. So we should get ourselves into a position of a normal free trade agreement where we have a degree of mutual recognition, a degree of equivalence, and that we're able to control our own laws.
So we will remain aligned?
Well, we may remain aligned in some areas where we choose to achieve the same goals by the same means. But this is not new. This is not news. This is what the Prime Minister's set out in her previous speeches. But what we're all signed up to is taking back control of our laws, our borders, our money, our trade.
But not during the transition.
Well, that is clear. This is not a new. This is not a new statement.
So in
during
practice,
the implementation period,
in practice, I know that legally we leave after the Article 50 process, but we then enter a transition period. In practice, de facto, what would the difference be between membership and the transition period?
Well, crucially, we'll start negotiating and signing our own free trade agreements. Signing, but not bringing them into effect. Now, because that's what the ERG wants too. We'll be able to sign trade agreements. That is the government's policy, Andrew, that during the implementation period, we'll negotiate them, we can sign them, but we can only bring them into effect at the end of the implementation.
I understand the effect, but you think we'll be able to sign free trade agreements during a transition period? Not just talk, not just scope out, not just even negotiate, not even agree but pigeonhole till we leave. We'll actually be able to sign them and agree them.
So, Andrew, I'm expecting us to agree them to come into effect after the implementation.
That bit I get, but we'll sign them?
Yeah, I think I'm saying yes repeatedly.
All right, no, but the reason why I ask again, it's quite unusual to get such clarity on any of these questions. So I apologise, I'm somewhat taken aback, but uniqueness does take me aback. David Davis says that he wants to work with the EU for a race to the top in rules and regulations, but he wants to work. So that would mean that we're going to mirror each other. What's the point of leaving?
So the point here is to go to the race to the top in global standards. We know the British public require high standards in our country, right across a range of issues, from working conditions, the environment, product standards. But what we want to do is get to a position where we're leading a race to the top in high quality standards
our rules
globally.
In practice, the impact of our rules and regulations will be the same as the European Union's rules and regulations.
Well, the objectives may well be the same, but the point is that we get the opportunity to strive towards those objectives in different ways. So the point would be, for example, Ian Duncan-Smith sat on your programme, pulled out his list of regulations and talked about, for example, the next round of solvency or MiFID regulations. The point here is that we should have control of our own laws, our own regulations, and have the opportunity to strive towards similar goals in different ways so that we get regulatory autonomy and we can find the best way to meet high standards.
And what would happen if our idea of rules and regulations for financial services went in a very different direction from Europe's?
Well, what we need to do is agree a regime of mutual recognition and a degree of regulatory
So we'd have to take into account what they would want as well. It's not like being in the European Union.
No, it wouldn't be like being in the European Union. So in any free trade agreement, there's always going to be a mechanism for regulatory coordination, but that doesn't mean that one is compelled to accept law which is forced down from a superior body.
I understand.
So one would have the choice whether or not to adjust and take whatever the consequences might be.
But if we were going to change some of our regulatory standards, we'd go to Brussels and say, what do you think?
I would not expect us to have to seek consent under a normal free trade agreement arrangement. What I would expect is for us to go about the business of conducting a multidimensional trade policy, to have some unilateral measures, some bilaterally with the EU and other countries, some plurilateral agreements with multiple member states, and some multilateral arrangements with the World Trade Organization and through it. That's why we have our ambassador at the WTO chairing the Trade in Services Committee, because we need to move the whole world forward to liberalisation on trade in services, which you know is 80% of our economy.
How long would the transition period last?
Well, the transition period, the length of it is a matter for discussion, but
Well, we know what the Europeans think. They want it to end in December 2020. So what's the British government's position?
Well, that is the position of the European Union. The government has said we think that the right period is about 2 years in order to carry out all the implementation which is necessary.
Why does it need to be longer? Why does a Eurosceptic like you want it to be even longer than the European Union wants?
Well, I'd be quite happy for us to have the minimum period necessary to get out successfully into the new arrangements. But that is a matter to negotiate with the European Commission. You can see that they want us to exit at the end of the budget period. Right. The Prime Minister is suggesting 2 years. But what will be the case is when we've agreed, there'll be a fixed date, and that will be the date.
So it will be time limited?
Oh, absolutely.
On Labour's position on the customs union, what's the difference between a customs union and the customs union?
Well, a customs union is something that would be negotiated between the British government and the European Union to maintain tariff-free trade and a soft border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland.
And in what way would it differ?
Well, it may differ. It's down to negotiation, but it may differ in the sense that we retain access to tariff-free trade with the European Union, but we also have freedom to enter into third-party negotiations on free trade with other countries.
So you think we can be in a customs union and still have the right to negotiate free trade agreements?
Well, that's why we want to have the transition period, so that we can have that extra time to sit down with our European colleagues and partners and negotiate a deal that works in the interests of Britain.
But can you point to a single sign, the slightest sliver of a sign, that the European Union is prepared to agree to us being in a customs union and to negotiate our own free trade agreements?
Look, don't be a pessimist, Andrew. You know, I would hope...
Don't try and get out of it with a joke. Can you point to any sign that they would agree to that?
That a future Labour government would approach the Brexit negotiations in a very different manner to the current government, and that we would be able to sit down with our European partners and negotiate a deal that works in the interests of both.
But do you agree that at the moment there has never been the merest indication from Mr. Barnier or Mr. Juncker or the Germans or the French that they would in any way even contemplate Britain being in a customs union with them that still allowed Britain to have free trade deals? Do you agree with that?
But they're dealing with Steve and his government, aren't they?
No, but you've talked to them as well.
But they have a very different
But
position.
Mr. Corbyn's talked to them. Have you had any indication that that would even be on the agenda for the Europeans?
Well, absolutely. We believe that we can negotiate...
No, but what indication?
Well, we believe we can negotiate a customs union arrangement with the European Union.
I know what you want, but what I'm asking you is, can you show me any indication? Have you been given any indication in the several meetings your leaders had with Mr. Barnier that this would even be discussed by them?
Well, we wouldn't be putting it down as an option to be on the table if we didn't think it was possible, Andrew.
But so give me the evidence that it's possible.
Well, we believe it is possible.
You believing something isn't a definition of possibility. What would be possible would be if Mr. Barnier had indicated that this is a route he would be prepared to consider. Can you give me any evidence that he's indicated that?
Well, we believe that we will be
what you believe.
Well, we believe, and this is the answer I'm going to give you, we believe that we will be in a position to negotiate a tariff-free trade agreement.
It's fantastical, isn't it?
Well,
yes, it is.
From everything that Mr. Barnier said, it's fantasy.
I don't believe it is fantasy. I think that it's in the interests of the British people that we secure this deal.
Andrew, if we were in a customs union with the European Union, then the European Union would set our external tariffs. That's what it means to be in a customs union, and that's what it means. And so we wouldn't be able to negotiate free trade deals, and Andrew's argument falls.
OK. You mean that, Andrew?
This Andrew.
Very well. This Andrew never falls.
The government has published its latest proposals for how Britain's relationship with the EU will work in the period immediately after Brexit. The document says ministers want to have a transition period of around 2 years, during which time Britain will abide by EU laws. But there's no mention of changes to immigration. Our political editor Laura Kunsberg reports.
No, not that red bus. Campaigners who want Brexit to get stuck brought their own to Westminster.
The government's going to have more difficulty getting Brexit through the House of Lords than this bus is coming in here.
Under pressure, it's a big week for the Prime Minister to show she's making progress with her plans.
Prime Minister!
We want to ensure that this is a country that can negotiate free trade deals around the rest of the world. We want to ensure that we have a good trade agreement with the European Union, and that's what we'll be starting to negotiate. We want to ensure we have a good security partnership with the European Union.
It isn't clear from today's exchanges this government isn't on the road to Brexit, Mr. Speaker. It's on the road to nowhere.
But for all the arguing, what matters to the government right now is this: the guidelines for the implementation phase, or the transition. That's the period of time after we've left the European Union, when broadly not very much will change for quite some time. The UK thinks it'll take about 2 years to make all the changes. But Brexiteers are nervous about this phrase, that the timeframe could be shaped simply by how long it will take to prepare and implement the new processes and systems. Basically, it will be the EU status quo. The rights and obligations of the UK will continue. But a joint committee should be set up so the UK still has a say over changes to any rules and on some specific areas like fishing. There is no mention in today's text about immigration, the core argument in the referendum. Number 10 says the Prime Minister will still insist that the system changes as soon as we leave the European Union. But a government source told me to expect the UK to back down on that in the face of resistance from Brussels. How bullish are ministers?
Our starting point has been, as the Prime Minister has set out, that we would allow people to come and go and live out their lives and live and work in the UK during the implementation period on the same basis as before. But we will need to have a conversation about how they will continue on after the implementation.
EU leaders and Theresa May aren't a million miles apart in the talks about transition. But however friendly the three-kiss greetings with the Dutch PM were today, ends have to be tied up and a lot of discussions still to be had.
Discussion at this moment is about 2 years, and of course the discussion will then be, if things move smoothly, whether at the end of the 2 years you would allow for a short extension. That debate is still going on.
The Brexit Secretary and his cabinet colleagues still have plenty of convincing to do in European capitals, like in Athens today, at home with their party, and of course, most importantly, with you. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Now, Downing Street has insisted tonight there will be a firm end date to the Brexit transition period. It came after a document showed the government is proposing the UK stays part of the EU as long as necessary. Well, tomorrow the Prime Minister holds a crunch meeting with senior cabinet ministers to thrash out an agreement. And our political correspondent Paul Brand is in Downing Street for us tonight. So, Paul, this is tricky timing, isn't it, for Mrs May?
Yeah, Mary, the Prime Minister is hoping the calm and quiet of her countryside retreat at Chequers will soothe her cabinet tomorrow into some kind of agreement over what Brexit should look like, the trade deal that we want to end up with when it comes to the EU. But back here in London, all the noise right now is over how we get to that point, the transition period once we leave. Theresa May was actually meeting her Dutch counterpart today, just as the British government releases its negotiating stance with the EU over this transition period. And on first reading, that document seems to suggest the transition could just go on and on. It says the transition period's duration should be determined simply by how long it will take. Now, since then, Downing Street has insisted there will be an end date to this transition period. It'll last around 2 years, and that there's broad agreement with the EU on most of this. But that agreement is hard to find back here. Over 60 Tory MPs have written to the Prime Minister saying that she must not go soft on this transition. And just today, Remainers were driving around Westminster in that Brexit bus. They've given it a bit of a new paint job, warning that Brexit will cost up to £2 billion per week. So look, it's going to be tricky for the Prime Minister tomorrow. We know that Brexit doesn't always bring people together, not least of all her own cabinet.
OK, Paul Brand in Downing Street, thank you.
I've been getting away with it all